Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Professor Kim Sung-han, Director of Ilmin International Relations Institute. I'm very delighted to have this opportunity to introduce today's very distinguished speaker. Before I begin the introduction, I'd like to make three housekeeping announcements. First of all, I kindly ask you to switch off your cell phones and cameras. Please note that taking pictures during the lecture is not allowed. Second, media coverage of this special event is not allowed either. Some cameras and photographers are here solely for internal record. Finally, if you have a question during the lecture, why don't you write down your question on a paper you received at the entrance. Your questions will be collected later by IRI staff members and asked to the speaker by myself for the sake of saving time. Thank you for your cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, this morning we have a very special speaker, Dr. 콘돌리자 Rice. She is currently the Denning Professor in Global Business and Economy and the Thomas and Barbara Stevenson Senior Fellow on Public Policy at the Hoover Institution and the Professor of Political Science at Stanford University. From 2005 to 2009, Dr. Rice served as the Secretary of State of the United States. She was the second woman and the first African-American woman to hold that post. Dr. Rice also served the first female National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2005. Dr. Rice served as the Provost of Stanford University from 1993 to 1999, during which she was the Chief of Budget and Academic Officer. From 1989 through March 1991, Dr. Rice served on President George H.W. Bush's National Security Council staff. She served as Director and Senior Director of Soviet and East European Affairs and Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. As Professor of Political Science, Dr. Rice has been on the Stanford faculty since 1981, and she has won two of the highest teaching honors. She received the Walter J. Gores Award of Excellence in Teaching in 1984, and also she received a School of Humanities and Science Dean's Award for Distinguished Teaching in 1993. She has authored and co-authored numerous books, including two bestsellers, No Higher Honor in 2011 and Extraordinary Ordinary People published in 2010. I was personally very impressed by the book entitled Germany Unified and Europe Transformed, which was co-authored with Philip Jellicoe in 1995. Her record-breaking career has not only been limited to politics and academics. Speaking of her personal side, she is a pianist and a great athlete. As an accomplished golfer, Dr. Rice was the first woman to join the Augusta National Golf Club in Georgia, which had been known as all-male membership golf club. As an expert in both academia and the field of international relations, Dr. Rice is expected to share her insights with all of us today on unification of Korea and the role of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. 콘돌리자. Dr. Rice, if you don't mind, can we move the students to the stages because they are standing up there?
It's fine, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I like having students around me.
Why don't you come to the stage rather than just standing outside? Okay? Why don't you move? Okay, you can move actually. You guys can move to the stage.
Yes. If you sit on the stage, you have to help me with my speech. All right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to Korea University. Dr. Kim, thank you for the wonderful introduction. I do just have to say that I am a much better pianist than I am golfer. Because I studied piano from the age of 3, and before I begin my remarks about issues of foreign policy and issues of unification on the peninsula, I just want to say a word to the students gathered here, because my own career is really an example of something that I think is very important when you're in college. I actually started college as a piano major. I was determined to be a great concert musician. I had studied piano from the age of 3. I could read music before I could read books. But after my second year in college, I went to study that summer at something called the Aspen Music Festival School, a place where a lot of very good pianists go to study. And I met people who were 12 years old who could play far better than I was ever going to be able to play. And I thought, you are not going to be a great concert pianist. Find something else. And fortunately, after trying many things, I took a course in international politics. It was taught by a Soviet specialist, a man named Joseph Korbel. Joseph Korbel was also Madeleine Albright's father. But Joseph Korbel, in that class, opened up to me the world of diplomacy, of international politics, of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And all of a sudden, I had found what I was passionate about doing. It is really important that while you are in school, you find what you're passionate about, what you love to do. Not just what job you are going to get, not just what career you will have, but what you really love and what will make you get up every day and want to go and do that. Now, there was no reason that a girl, a black girl, from Birmingham, Alabama, would want to be a specialist on the Soviet Union. I was just very interested. And many years later, when I was special assistant to President George H.W. Bush for Soviet affairs, I found myself in a helicopter with Mikhail Gorbachev. Just Gorbachev, Mrs. Gorbachev, me, and the Secret Service. And I thought, I'm really glad that I changed my major and found something that I like to do. Find your passion while you're here, and many other things in life will fall into place. My career is as a professor of international politics, as the provost of Stanford University in the 1990s, and then as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. It really has, I've come to understand that those two careers are linked in a very important way. They're linked because in the world today, a country's measure of greatness in the international system, a country's ability to really affect global politics, comes from its ability to develop its human potential. In the 19th century, a country's greatness depended on its resources. What could it dig out of the ground? Coal and steel and oil and gas. And then, at the end of the 20th century, the middle of the 20th century, it was how fast could you industrialize? And what did your industrial processes look like? But at the end of the 20th century and in the beginning of the 21st century, the key to national greatness lies in the development of human potential. And you are a part of the future of this country's human potential and of this region's human potential and of this world's human potential. And so if you take your educational responsibilities seriously in these years at this great university, if you recognize that education is not a right, Education is not an entitlement. Education is a gift. It is a privilege. And having the privilege of being educated people will allow you to play a role in this country's future, in the region's future, in the world's future. And you have to commit today that you understand the responsibilities that you will take on as educated people to try to make it a more peaceful and a more prosperous world. Asia is in the midst of a tremendous transition. I was first in this country in 1988. Korea was just beginning to emerge as a democracy. Korea was just beginning to emerge as a developed country. No one could have imagined what the future of Korea would look like. A wonderful, vibrant democracy that debates everything about its future. That's the great thing about democracy. You know, it's a little chaotic sometimes. It's even a little frightening sometimes, because it is a disruptive idea, democracy, that everybody has a role to play in the governance of their country, that you have certain rights to say what you think, to worship as you please, to be free from the arbitrary power of the state, and that you have the dignity that comes with knowing that those who would govern you have to ask for your consent to govern you. That is the best of the human condition, as hard as democracy is. But it is also on that basis that creativity and innovation take place. There is a reason that Korea has moved from a developing country to one that is leading the world in so many of the technologies that are a part of the knowledge-based revolution that's changing the way that we live. I am absolutely certain that almost every one of you has a smartphone. When I was in college, oh, forget when I was in college. When I was in graduate school, when I was a professor, when I was Secretary of State, nobody had a smartphone. This is something that has happened very quickly, and Korea is a part of that transformation. And Korean innovation and creativity will be part of other transformations as well. Because the role of knowledge is, of course, in and of itself, an important role to expand the realm of human knowledge. But it is also when human knowledge is applied to the problems that we have, whether it is the problem of people who still live in parts of this world on $1 a day, people who still live in parts of this world with the fear that their children will succumb to malaria and other easily treatable diseases, preventable diseases. That we have a world that needs to protect our environment while growing our economies. These are the problems that we will only be able to solve if we can bring human knowledge to bear on those problems. And therefore, ideas become action. That's the future of our world, and that's the future of this region. And it is in that context that I would like to place the issue of the unification of Korea, which will come in time. I wrote with Philip Zelikow, as Dr. Kim mentioned, a book called Germany Unified and Europe Transformed. I was fortunate to be on the White House staff, the National Security Council staff, as the specialist for Soviet affairs for President George H.W. Bush when the Soviet Union was in the process of collapsing, when Eastern Europe was being liberated, and when the most surprising of all developments took place, Germany unified, completely and fully on democratic Western terms, and completely and fully integrated into the Western alliance. I can tell you that when I went to work for President Bush in January of 1989, after he was inaugurated, nobody in the administration thought that about a year later we would be looking at the certain unification of Germany. I was asked by someone a few days ago, when did you know that Germany was going to unify? I would say that I had my first hint that Germany was going to unify in October of 1989, and by October of 1990, Germany was fully unified. It was not that we were too stupid to see it coming. It was that events like this have a way of happening very quickly, very unexpectedly, because when a country is divided, as Germany was, and as Korea is currently, there is a reason for that division. It has to do with the structure of the international system. It has to do with the distribution of power in the international system. And it has to do with internal developments in the countries that are a part of that division. Suddenly, those circumstances can change. And one thing that I would say to you about the day that you realize that Korea is about to be unified, be prepared. Be prepared for uncertainty. Be prepared for people who are concerned and nervous about it. Be prepared for the fact that you may, perhaps will not have seen it coming. Now, the topic that I've been given is what can the U.S. do for unification? But I think that that question is in many ways less important than the question of what can the Republic of Korea do for unification. Because much rests in your hands, much rests in the hands of countries in the region, and of course, there is a role for the global society to play and for the United States to play. But let us begin with why there is a division of Korea. There's a division of Korea coming out of the war. There's a division of Korea coming out of the security situation. But there is also a division of Korea because one part of Korea has gone into the future, strong, democratic, prosperous, and one part of Korea is left behind, poor, frightened, authoritarian, and threatening peace and security in the world. I, as Secretary of State, worked very hard on the North Korean problem, as we called it. I never really liked to refer to it as the North Korean problem, because that suggests that if it is a problem, it has a solution, if you can only find that solution. I instead referred to it as the North Korean question. What will it take to change circumstances in North Korea so that the North Korean people can begin to live a better life, so that there is freedom for them to begin to choose their way, and so that prosperity can govern the Korean Peninsula in peace and in prosperity. I'm a Russianist, and the Russians have a wonderful word, вопрос. That word can mean problem, issue, or question. And so let me refer to it as the North Korean вопрос. The North Korean вопрос, the North Korean question, is how do we maintain until the day that transformation is possible in North Korea? First and foremost, peace and security here on the Korean Peninsula as one of the pillars of peace and security in an Asia that is transforming. The last thing that we want is conflict here in the Asia-Pacific region that would stop the tremendous progress that is being made here in Korea, in Japan, and most especially in China, which is going through an historic transformation of its own. All countries of Asia need a peaceful and secure environment here on the continent. Now, North Korea is unfortunately a threat to that peace and security. We worked very hard through the six-party talks to which South Korea, Russia, Japan, the United States, and China belong, and to which North Korea itself belongs. We worked very hard to try and manage the problem of a potential nuclear North Korea. Several times, I will tell you, that we thought we had a deal. Several times, we signed pieces of paper that said North Korea understood that the Korean Peninsula had to be denuclearized. Several times, we signed pieces of paper that the North Koreans said they would permit inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency to come in and see what was going on with their programs. Several times, they promised to dismantle parts of their program, always in exchange for a step-by-step incorporation of North Korea into the community of states. First with food assistance, with oil assistance, fuel oil, and little by little to try and bring North Korea into the international community. It was not a matter of an international community that was unwilling to bring North Korea in. It was a matter of a North Korea that continually broke every agreement that it undertook. That cannot continue if there's to be peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. And the countries that are party to the six-party talks, Russia and China, the United States, Japan, and South Korea, have to be steadfast and strong in saying to the North Koreans that it is not acceptable to break agreements. It is not acceptable to continue toward a nuclear weapon. It is not acceptable to threaten, as Kim Jong-un does almost daily, the security of the region, the security of their neighbors. It's simply not acceptable. But if North Korea is prepared to enter the international community, we ought to again be welcoming of their doing that. We ought to again be willing to accept North Korea into the international community. And what does that mean? I've always thought that first and foremost, if we can deal with the nuclear problem, we could begin to alleviate the suffering of the North Korean people. It is the saddest of circumstances to see a people completely isolated from the benefits of the international community, to see a people where malnutrition means that the average height of a North Korean is shrinking more and more and more. I don't know if you know, but a few years ago, the North Koreans had to revise their standards for military service to allow people who were 4'11" to serve. That is the effect of years of isolation and malnutrition. Looking away from what is happening to the North Korean people will not serve the interest of peace and prosperity and security in this country, or in the region, or in the world. Sooner or later, through international assistance, through the World Bank, we have got to find a way to alleviate the suffering of the North Korean people. And you do realize that the North Korean people increasingly know that there is another world out there. They look at pirated videos from South Korea. The propaganda of the North Korean regime that South Korea is a prison camp and North Korea is paradise is no longer believed by anybody, even the most isolated North Koreans. And so information matters. The willingness to break down the ability of the North Korean regime to deceive its people about their status in life, about the circumstances they face. This is something that we must do. And so we must keep peace and security through denying North Korea a nuclear weapon. We must look for opportunities to improve the circumstances of the North Korean people. We must have a compassionate attitude toward those people. And so I have never believed that food ought to be used as a weapon. When the North Korean people are starving, we have to feed them, because it is not their fault that they live under that form of government. But ultimately, if you ask me, what is really the secret to unification? It will be when the two Koreas come closer together in terms of respect for their people, respect for peace and security in this region, and when the North Korean people begin to have a voice. The story of German unification is that that can happen sometimes more quickly than anyone ever imagined. And working toward that day is a critical responsibility of all of us who are fortunate to live on the right side of history. I believe that it will happen. There will be a unified Korea. And what will be the character of that unified Korea? It will be a Korea that is democratic, as South Korea is, because the future does not belong to authoritarians. People are no longer willing to just live silently in tyranny. People all over the world are saying enough. And so it will be a democratic, unified Korea. It will be a Korea, a unified Korea, that is a tremendous contributor to the international economy and to prosperity that comes from a growing international economy. It will be a unified Korea that has great companies, small and large, that are pushing the envelope and pushing the limits of what human knowledge can do to change the way that we live. And it will, I believe, be a unified Korea that is a good and reliable and faithful friend of the United States of America. Because the reason that our alliance, our relationship with the Republic of Korea is so strong has only a little bit to do with the history of this country's security circumstances and its coming into being out of the war. It really has only a little to do increasingly with the security relationship that we have and must maintain. It really has to do with common values. Common belief that human beings deserve to live in freedom. Common belief that human beings deserve to fully recognize and realize their potential. A common belief that those of us who are fortunate enough to have a responsibility to those who do not have. Indeed, one of the things that I want to encourage you as students to do is to be sure that when you are exercising the responsibilities of an educated person, that you take the time to realize that there are people who might have ended up at Korea University. They were just as smart. They were just as hardworking. But for whatever reason, their circumstances did not allow it. And that you'll reach out to children who might need help in learning to read, to elderly people who might have no one else to visit them. Because the strongest foundation of democracy is actually not what our governments do, but what we do for each other. Individuals helping individuals, individuals recognizing that every life is worthy and acting on it. And from that, the United States and the Republic of Korea sharing this value that every life is worthy. We will continue to be a beacon for those people of North Korea who must wonder from time to time if anybody still cares, if anybody still listens, if anybody really believes that every North Korean life is worthy too. It is by example, it is by energy, it is by commitment, it is by acceptance of responsibility that we do not have the luxury, we do not have the right to keep our prosperity, our peace, and our freedoms to ourselves, but to always recognize that we cannot rest until there is no corner of tyranny any place in the world. That is our obligation as people who live in the great gift of democracy, as people who've been given the great gift of education, and as people who really do want to see one day a peaceful, prosperous world in which every citizen, including those in North Korea, can play their part. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rice. We're going to have a Q&A session. So while collecting some questions from the floor, I will ask questions,
Yes.
if you don't mind. You mentioned German unification. So from your perspective, what kind of lessons Korea can take out of German unification? That is the most important kind of a lesson. And secondly, which one do you think is easier to persuade Russia for German unification and persuade China for Korean unification?
Yes, very
these
good
are my
question.
two
Yes.
questions.
Well, I think the lesson of German unification is that the German people were more ready for unification than we even knew. Now, I said that it happened very suddenly, but in fact, over the period of about 20 years, more, almost 30 years, West Germany had been reaching out to East Germans. I can remember my first trip to Germany was actually to East Germany, done through the Lutheran Church. So there had been some contacts between the German peoples. The East Germans had not really been able to prevent that from taking place. And so in that sense, it's a little bit different than the situation here, although there are family reunification visits. There are efforts to work through economic ties. Occasionally there will be talks about the ability to transit for cultural and other reasons. I myself, by the way, approved the New York Philharmonic going to North Korea to play, because I think it's a good thing for the North Koreans to have to let a little fresh air into Pyongyang. And the very interesting thing is that the New York Philharmonic played the American national anthem. And this was apparently quite a moment for everyone. So those kinds of contacts do help, because eventually you want the two peoples to be ready. Secondly, and this is not great, it's expensive when it happens. Just like East Germany, which was bankrupt by the time unification took place, if East Germany was bankrupt, imagine the circumstances for North Korea. And so I think that if you get to the place that this is done, one has to have an historic view that it is worth doing even if it is costly. Finally, China. Some think that China wants the division of Korea because it does not want to see the unification lead to the unified Korea that I described. In other words, democratic, capitalist, prosperous, and an ally of the United States. My own view is that much of how China will view this depends on what role China comes to play in the region. To the degree that China is more and more integrated into the international economy, to the degree that China realizes that its prosperity is based on peace and security in the region and cooperative relations rather than old territorial claims, that China may recognize that there may be benefits from a Korea that is strong and unified rather than a North Korea that they are constantly having to worry about exactly what will Kim Jong-un do. The Chinese do not want, I really do believe this, a nuclear North Korea, and so much depends on how China itself has evolved in terms of the Asia-Pacific region.
Okay, I have a bunch of questions over here. I start with the role of the United States. The questions are as follows. Would the United States still support Korean unification if the Chinese condition for the support of unification is an American exit plan from the Korean peninsula? Similar question is here. Do you believe that what concrete national interest for United States exists for Korean unification? Is it stronger than the interest for maintain the status quo? To what extent would the United States be willing to intervene in the case of a repeat of the Crimean crisis in eastern Ukraine? But probably this is euphemism
for in the region.
For Korean case.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Would you?
Yes. Sure.
Yeah.
I am not certain that China would actually want an exit of the United States from the Asia-Pacific region because this region has a number of unresolved territorial issues from the past that without an American presence, and the United States, of course, does not have those territorial issues, and so I think the United States actually plays a stabilizing role by being a part of the Asia-Pacific. And in their deepest views, I think the Chinese understand that. And so I'm not sure that they would make a condition the exit. You may not know this. I wrote about it in my book, but it's not a terribly well-known episode. We actually talked to the Chinese about if the North Koreans were really serious about denuclearization and were to verifiably get rid of their nuclear programs, beginning to discuss a peace treaty with the North Koreans. We talked about that. And the basis of that, of course, would have to be that the alliances in this region would be unharmed by that kind of treaty. Because the national interest of the United States is, of course, in a unified, democratic, prosperous Korea that is a friend of the United States, just as our interests were in a unified, strong, democratic, prosperous Germany that was an ally of the United States. And so I think you will find that if the time comes, when the time comes, that Korean unification is possible, one of the strongest supporters of it, maybe the strongest supporter of it, will be the United States. That it may actually be harder for the neighbors. This was the case in Germany. The French weren't so happy. The British really weren't happy. And so it was the United States that kept saying, but why wouldn't we want a unified, democratic Germany that is a friend of Western Europe? And so I think you would find that the U.S. would be completely on board. Now, as to intervention, I'm no longer in the government, so I won't try to speak for my government, but I will just reiterate what President Obama said when he was here, which is that the United States takes absolutely seriously and as an article of responsibility and obligation all of the security arrangements, treaties, agreements that we hold in this region. I cannot imagine an American president who would not respond if one of our allies was in trouble in some way. And I'm very glad that the president came here. I'm very glad that he reiterated that. The situation in Ukraine is a very sad one. I think it is because Vladimir Putin does not accept the way that the Cold War ended. In fact, he has said that the end of the Soviet Union was one of the great tragedies of the 20th century. So that lets us know where he stands. And we're going to have to deal with Ukraine and Russia on its own circumstances. But as an American, I just want you to know that I think the American people are exactly where President Obama said we are. Our obligations to this region are unassailable, and no one should doubt them.
Second round. Do you think the United States has a long-term grand plan in East Asia? General MacArthur complained about lack of such plan in the Truman administration, and in that sense, I want to listen to your view about long-term grand strategy in East Asia on the part of the United States.
I'm teaching a course right now for some students on grand strategy. And the question that we are going to deal with next week is, has the United States ever had a grand strategy at any time in its more than 200-year history? I think the United States is not very good at grand strategy, frankly. I think what we're very good at is having a view of how human history ought to unfold. That view is that people should be free politically, there should be political freedom, and that economic freedom and economic openness are the way to prosperity. And so it's actually a very simple view of human history. If the world is, if people are freer, and if economies are freer, then the world will be more peaceful and it will be better. And that's how we have viewed the world really since our founding. If you go back and even read some of the American founding fathers, that's how they viewed the world. It was just that we didn't at that time have the capacity to try to shape that world. So if you look at how we tried to shape the world after World War II, when we were by far the most powerful country, we tried to give everybody a chance toward a democratic future. You know, returning to Germany, the British view of how to deal with Germany after the war was expressed by Churchill, who said, I like Germany so much, I would like as many of them as possible. His idea was break it up into little parts. The American view was build a democratic Germany, a capitalist Germany, and it won't fight ever again with its neighbors, and create the European Union of democracies and NATO, which is an alliance of democratic states. In Japan, to have a peace constitution that was a democratic constitution, to try to help South Korea over a period after the Korean War to move toward democracy. And so we have a view, but it isn't a grand strategy or a grand plan. And so if it sometimes seems that the United States is a little bit, in its own way, clumsy, a little bit not very good at moving from point A to point B, we're a very big and complicated place with a lot of different views. But the one view that is strongly held is that the world is going to be better if it's more democratic and if its economies are freer. It's why we promote free trade. I'm really delighted that the CORS agreement, the agreement with South Korea for free trade, was finally ratified. And so we have some things that we try to do, but I would never call it a grand strategy. It's why we continue to talk to the Chinese about the importance of human rights and religious freedom in China, as well as economic reform.
Okay. Do you think UN sanctions to North Korea really work in the peace process for Korean Peninsula, or they are not working? Do you think the Sunshine Policy is the best way to persuade North Korea moving towards unification, or United States and Republic of Korea, together with the international community, should employ so-called coercive diplomacy?
Well, the fact is that you have to convince the North Koreans that they will not be allowed to get a nuclear weapon. And you do that through two tracks. On the one hand, through sanctions and coercive diplomacy. And when they do things like set off nuclear devices, as they have several times, including when I was secretary and I came here shortly after that, you really have no choice but to sanction that behavior so that they know that it's unacceptable. And by the way, the sanctions in the UN tend to pass unanimously when the North Koreans engage in that kind of activity. At the same time, I think you always keep open the possibility that there is a diplomatic solution to the North Korean nuclear issue. And so the joint agreed framework that we signed in September of 2005 has very clear steps that the United States and the other powers are prepared to take if North Korea is prepared to denuclearize. And so I think you keep that open. Now, I won't use the term sunshine policy because, of course, that has a specific meaning here in Korea associated with the regime of Kim Da-jung when I was first coming into office. And so let me not use the specific term. Let me use instead the term that I do think it is good to try to breathe fresh air into North Korea. And you do that not through trying to accommodate the regime, but rather trying as much as you can to appeal to the circumstances of the North Korean people. And keeping open the possibility that they can rejoin the international community. As I said, it may seem like a small thing, but it was quite controversial for us to allow the New York Philharmonic to go there. People said, "Oh, you are just strengthening the regime." Well, I don't think so, because it was good for the North Korean people to see, or at least some North Korean people to see, that the United States did not have ill will toward them.
How does the presence of China affect unification of Korea?
Yeah.
Do you think China can be the beneficiary of unification of Korea?
I would say to the Chinese, you are going to be so much safer, we all are, with a unified, democratic, strong, prosperous South Korea that does not build nuclear weapons and go and shoot things at its neighbors, than you are with a secretive 29, 30, or 31-year-old, whatever he is, who alternatively asks for negotiations and threatens to fire off missiles, nuclear devices. Is that really the world that you want to live in, Beijing? And I actually think the Chinese are, I think we sometimes overestimate the influence of the Chinese with the North Koreans. The North Koreans kind of understand the situation here. The situation is the Chinese don't want the regime to collapse. Therefore, even though they know that much of what the North Koreans are doing is dangerous, they can only push so hard and so far. And so the North Koreans know that they can get away with a lot because the Chinese don't want them to collapse. So if the Chinese were ever to be able to say to the North Koreans, we actually don't care if you collapse, we might get a better situation on the Korean Peninsula, because every time the North Koreans shoot off a nuclear device or launch a missile or threaten, it really does, it's not a good thing for China either. I remember the nuclear device that they exploded in 2006. They gave the Chinese 1 hour notice. 1 hour notice. And here were the Chinese calling President Bush and President Putin and all of the countries around the world, and they were embarrassed. They were embarrassed to be put in that situation. And so I think if we can convince the Chinese that ultimately this will be a more stable circumstance, that they will begin to see their interests differently.
In what way, excuse me, do you think the USFK continues after Korean unification? If not, do you think the United States will withdraw their troops from the Korean Peninsula? Similar question. Instead of the aspect of the expansion of liberty and freedom, what would be the real value and benefit of Korean unification for the United States? Mm-hmm. Will unified Korea still be a strong ally of the United States, assuming that key security threat has been peacefully resolved after unification?
Well, first of all, let me just say that I think that what sustains our relationship is really now our shared values politically and our shared values about an economy that is a growing, innovative, integrated economy. And that's not going to change. As a matter of fact, that would only get better with a unified Korea. And so I think this would continue to be a very strong friendship and alliance. It's also, I can't speak to what would happen with our military presence, but I can just tell you that our military presence has changed a lot over the last 50 years. It's a significantly different military presence than it was. One of the things that we did was to move away from Seoul. We have made a lot of progress in restructuring the nature of the U.S.-Korean military relationship. We will continue to work on issues of command and control going forward. And so the military relationship has been evolving anyway. And yes, its first goal is to make sure that you can deter trouble on the Korean Peninsula, but it also is a basis for peace in the region as a whole. I can only say that what happened with Germany is that the relationship got stronger. We changed even further the nature of our military presence there, but we maintain a military presence there. And so I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict the future, but I would suspect that a unified Korea would be we would be an even stronger relationship and an even greater integration. We're moving forward as the Republic of Korea in the United States, and since my belief is that a unified Korea would continue to be the Republic of Korea, and not some kind of strange merger. By the way, that's one thing to remember about German unification. There were two ideas about how to unify Germany. One was that there would be a merger of East Germany and West Germany with elements of each one in the survivor state. And some people had even talked about Germany being simultaneously in the Warsaw Pact and in NATO. We decided that didn't sound like a good idea. And so the way that Germany was unified was, I'll call it an acquisition. So the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, went away. And the successor state, the survivor state, was the Federal Republic of Germany with its flag, with its alliances. And I think the stronger model is that.
Lastly, you have been the role model since I was 13.
Oh. Thank you, whoever said that.
What is your dream? And it is well known that in the world of politics, men play a very strong and a significant role. How can you look so attractive and at the same time be outstanding politician?
Thank you very much. Well, I hope
there's one more question.
Yeah,
Would you give some advice for women to be a successful life manager, especially for Korean women?
Yes, of course. Well, I hope that being healthy and trying to look good isn't a problem if you want to be a politician. I actually think that if you take care of yourself, I'll just let you know, I was working out at the gym this morning before I came, because I think it's very important to have a balanced life. And I have been very fortunate to have a balanced life. I love what I do. I'm very grateful that I took that course in international politics, that I can travel around the world, that I was Secretary of State, which was the greatest job that I think you can have in the American government without running for office, which I don't ever intend to do. And so I really love what I do. I try to keep balance in my life. I continue to play the piano. I even take piano lessons. I play musical benefit concerts for children's music programs because in a lot of our schools, the budgets are not permitting music to be taught in the schools. And so I'm a part of charities that put instruments in school and make it possible for kids to take music lessons. I continue to love sports and be a part of that. But the most important thing, and this is the question about the dream, the most important thing is the people in your life. You know, it's very easy to think about what your career is or what your job is or all the activities that you're engaged in. But make time for people in your life, for family. My parents are now deceased, but I had the world's greatest parents, and I'm grateful that I had a good relationship with them, and every night I thank God that those were the parents that I had. I have extended family of cousins and aunts and uncles that I'm close to, and I have good friends. As an only child, good friends have been very important to me. And so my dream is to be blessed enough to continue to live a life in which I can do all of the things that I love doing, where I can get a little bit better at my golf game perhaps, and finally break 80 in golf. I really want to learn the Brahms second piano concerto before I leave this life. But I love being a professor. And I returned to the university because that is what I was meant to do. Universities are amazing places because you bring into them some of the best and brightest people from all parts of life, all walks of life, and they get together and they get to share ideas and they get to act on ideas. And there is nothing like the energy of a great university. I can feel it here in the room at Korea University. I know that we have it at Stanford. And when you get to be a part of that as a professor, you get to open up worlds to your students that they might otherwise never have seen, just as someone opened up those worlds to you. And so I will be a professor as long as Stanford will have me. I'm tenured, so that's as long as I want. As a professor, I am at that age in life now where students come back from 30 years ago and say, you know, a class that I took made a difference. And because I think people are the most important source of happiness in your life, that's what I want to continue to do. And to young women, I would say this: the horizons are unlimited for you. Don't let anybody tell you that there are ceilings through which you cannot break. When people say to me, you know, or when people say, you have to see somebody in that role who looks like you. Now, had I been waiting for a black female Soviet specialist role model, I would still be waiting. That's why there are firsts. That's why you follow only what it is that you want to do. My parents always said, because I grew up in racially segregated Birmingham, Alabama, you are going to have to be twice as good. And it helps to work to the point that you think you have worked hard enough to be twice as good, to know really what you're talking about, to be sure of your expertise. But trying to be twice as good is equally important for men as for women. And it is, if you believe that you've prepared, you will be confident, and then just go for it. Do whatever it is you're interested in doing, and don't let anybody define what that ought to be. Thank you very much.